call this subcommittee to order. Today's hearing is focused on the Baltic region, U.S. policy to the countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. My colleagues in Congress, other opinion makers, and policy deciders often refer to the danger or conflict of this region. The reality of what has been happening or not happening in this corner of the world deserves a closer and, yes, a more comprehensive examination. And that is what this hearing is all about. Our relationship with the Baltic people and governments stretching back nearly that relationship with the Baltic people probably the last 100 years, and we have stood by those populations through the Soviet period in our firm support for the rights of Baltic people to freely choose their own governance and not have it dictated to them by the Nazis, the communists, or anybody else. Those who know me know how strongly I believe in self-determination, and I am proud that American support helped these three Baltic countries reestablish their independence as communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. We stood by Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the past, and they can be confident that that will remain the case in the future. The citizens of the Baltics, like citizens in Eastern Europe, are not pieces on a board for foreign policy powers to manipulate and to control. They are fully and equally sovereign nations. Within that context, the Baltic nations were permitted to join NATO, which, as a consequence, has put troops that are part of a hostile military alliance positioned right on Russia's border, a potential threat from Russia's perspective. Whatever you think about Russia today, it behooves us to act responsibly and to recognize that Russia, too, is a powerful nation whose leaders make decisions based on their country's security and national interests. We do that as well as every other major power. However, the question today remains, has Russia stepped over the bounds of acceptable behavior, or has the U.S. been overreacting? Since 2014, there have been numerous NATO exercises in the Baltics. And when we say that, that means we have had numerous NATO military exercises within a relatively short distance from St. Petersburg and Moscow and directly on the Russian border. Some of our witnesses today will help explain what's happening and what's been happening there in the Baltics and why. Knowing the facts of what's happening certainly will help us determine what America's policy toward this region should be and what policy toward Russia. What should our policy be towards Russia as well? But establishing the prerequisites for a peaceful world must remain a priority for us and for the Russians and for the people in the Baltics. One thought, we here should do our best not to confuse a strong U.S. policy with a confrontational policy. The goal of peace through strength, what is the goal of peace through strength? It's not just strength, it's peace, and that we should never lose that perspective. I welcome our witnesses this afternoon. Without objections, your full written statements will be made part of the record. So if you could, we'd like to ask you to have maybe a 5-minute presentation, and then we will move on to questions and a dialogue with the panel and with the members. I'd like to focus on a few key questions that are, I'd like to know about specific acts that Russia is accused of doing in the Baltics. I don't want to talk about intentions. What are the specific acts that we should be most concerned about? And is our response to these specific acts reasonable, or is it belligerent? With that said, I would ask my ranking member, Mr. Meeks, to move forward with his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling today's hearing on U.S. policy regarding the Baltics. It's a region we do not always get to examine in detail, but do not often see in the news either.
What is the hurt?
Before my remarks, I'd like to take a moment, though, to remember the attacks in Brussels just 1 year ago. And today, we see a symbol of democracy being attacked again in London. It's a reminder that democracy is continuous, it's daily, and it's difficult. And we mourn those that may have lost their lives in the attack in London today. The Balts hold a special place in modern history. I admire their citizens for their peaceful, brave resistance to the Soviet regime during the nonviolent singing revolution. Soviet repression was not able to crush their cultures, their people, or their thirst for freedom. A beautiful story that one that resonates here in the United States Congress. The U.S. never recognized the Soviet occupation by force, and upon their liberation, they continued normal diplomatic relations. The same international laws compel us to never recognize the Kremlin's attempt to annex Crimea. In 1991, newly independent Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and had to mature quickly in a dangerous post-communist space where corruption, economic malice, and ethnic divisions were always a threat. The scars from the transformation can be seen and manipulated by outside actors today. Nevertheless, they are free. They reformed. They banged on the doors to Europe, saying, "Don't forget us." They persisted. They joined NATO and the EU in 2004 and continued to play integral roles in both. Estonia takes over the presidency of the Council in July, and I look forward to learning more about their stories on the ground soon. I'm also a senior member of the Financial Services Committee and remember seeing the Baltic states suffer immensely during the financial crisis in 2008. Latvia saw its GDP shrink over 25% in less than a year, for example. The final result, a success story. Internal devaluation, belt tightening within an agreement between society and the government helped the small, open economies turn the corner and enjoy sustained growth. It was not easy, but the results are a best practice example for dealing with the euro crisis. The Baltic states are also leaders in the internet age. I admire the Estonia movement, the dedicated push to bring the country to the forefront in e-commerce and e-democracy, where citizens can vote and register businesses online. I believe we have a few e-residents in the crowd today. However, this makes Estonia vulnerable to cyber attacks, which they have experienced, most notably in 2008. The result? Estonia is now home to the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence, where all NATO member states can share and sharpen their skills in today's wired world. The region is also a leader in the push towards energy transformation and independence. Seeing and feeling the way the Russian government uses energy as a political tool is a direct threat to the economies and populations in the Baltic states. A striking example is Lithuanian LNG terminal independence, which is only a part of a puzzle linking the region with a competitive supply of energy. Projects like this help Lithuania and Europe both from an energy and supply side, and importantly, from a security angle. Finally, the success of the three states is an important symbol for those who need a united and free Europe. With NATO support, it is an important symbol for the region as an example of what can be achieved with membership in a transatlantic organizations that the guarantee of justice and the rule of law. Yet, as the Baltic states continue to integrate and flourish as democracies, they are under threat. I do not believe that Russian tanks will roll across their borders, but the threat from the Kremlin is often subtle, often denied in fact or post-fact world, but just as real and just as powerful. Their tools corrupt our information sphere, our economies, and use cynicism only to protect kleptocracy in Moscow. I believe we have an excellent panel here to examine these threats and discuss the best responses. I believe we must support the free press, much like we recently examined with Chairman Royce at the full committee level. And I also would like to examine the role, both symbolic and economic, of personal sanctions, specifically the Magnitsky Act, which goes after corrupt individuals, not the Russian people. I'm also an adamant supporter of NATO and the EU's role in values-based transatlantic relationship, and our economies and people are better off with it. To conclude, I would like to submit two excellent reads for the record that shaped what I'm talking about today. President Reagan's proclamation 4948, which created Baltic Freedom Day, and President Obama's speech in Tallinn in 2014. These documents show the continued bipartisan support for the Baltic states and the freedom and democracy that they bravely fought to establish. I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I sure appreciate you putting some of my writing into the work.
I thought you'd like that.
All right. And then we have Mr. Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
for 2 minutes.
Yes, sir. The fall of the USSR in 1991 ushered in a new era of freedom for many former Soviet republics who had struggled for decades to maintain and express their national identities. The Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are prime examples of the demise of the Soviet Union and how the demise of the Soviet Union led to a freer and more independent Europe. After gaining their independence in the summer of 1991, the Baltic states began to craft their own economies, their own militaries, and even more importantly, their own identities. This is something that we as Americans should all appreciate. The Baltic states also desire to become part of the integrated global community by becoming both members of NATO as well as the European Union. However, in recent years, the Russian bear has once again reared its ugly head. We first saw this in 2008, when the Russian army invaded its fiercely independent southern neighbor, Georgia. In a quick but brutal war, the Russians showed what lengths they were willing to go in order to exert their dominance over their newly independent neighbors. Likewise, in 2014, Vladimir Putin covertly moved Russian military forces into the Crimean region, quickly seizing it. Subsequent that year, the Russian-backed insurgency began to take hold of the eastern Donbass region in Ukraine, culminating in the shoot-down of a Malaysian Airlines flight under very suspicious circumstances. This all being done with limited intervention from previous administrations. As we look forward, it's imperative that we maintain our relationship with critical allies in the Baltic states. We must reassert America's commitment to prevent the rise of another Soviet bloc where a country's leaders are beholden to Moscow and not their own people. I yield back.
And Mr. Cicilline. Oh, excuse me, Brad. Overlooking Brad. All right, Brad, you're first.
Okay. I want to associate myself with the comments of the ranking member, recognizing the people of Belgium and the people of the United Kingdom and what they've suffered, and his praise for the Baltic states. The foreign policy establishment has spoken. Everything that Putin does is wrong, and therefore anything done by anyone in conflict with Putin must be right. I will spend a few minutes questioning that second assumption. The Baltic states are indeed praiseworthy, but they can and should do better. I've been in this room for 20 years, and for most of that time, the foreign policy establishment said anyone who focused on burden sharing was ignorant or worse. Now they've caved in on that and instead clung to this 2% standard. It should be a 4% standard. America spends over 4% of our GDP on our military. The foreign policy establishment deliberately understates that by ignoring the cost of the veterans' benefits, which, after all, are compensation we provide our soldiers and sailors. Unfortunately, only one of the Baltic states even meets the 2% requirement, and the others, one other is saying they'll get to it eventually, but that leaves their armaments way too low a level because for decades they've been underspending. Baltic states should at least match our 4% level and make up for the armaments they don't have because they've deliberately underspent for decades. NATO is important. Only one NATO country has been attacked during NATO, and that is the United States. We had support in Afghanistan. The support from the Baltic states was there, but incredibly modest. In contrast, the Baltic states have asked us for an incredibly robust response to the national security threats that they face, including, as the chairman points out, deploying American soldiers by the thousand on the Russian border. In the United Nations, I've been disappointed with the Baltic states' support for us, voting against us again and again and again in the General Assembly, though I support the recent support of two of the Baltic states in one UNESCO vote. And finally, we need to urge the Baltic states to treat their Russian minorities with as much respect as possible and more respect than may be popular in their own among their own people, especially the Estonian issue with so many citizens of Estonia or residents of Estonia not having Estonian passports, not being recognized as citizens. I would hope that there would be a system that would allow dual citizenship and allow these folks to have whatever rights Russia chooses to grant them, but to have all the rights of Estonian citizens. There are many arguments on both sides as to how the Russian-speaking minority should be treated, but since this could be a flashpoint for a major war, I would hope the Baltic states were err on the side of treating their Russian-speaking minority well, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman, and now Mr. Cicciolini.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher and Ranking Member Meeks, for calling this hearing today, and to the witnesses for being here to discuss a region that is vital to America's strategic national security interests. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are located at Russia's doorstep, and in many ways are at the forefront in the increasing tensions in Eastern Europe. Each of these states serves as an example of the ability of a people to rise out of the chaos of the fall of the Soviet Union, embrace democracy and free markets, and thrive. Formerly members of the Warsaw Pact as part of the Soviet Union, today Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are vital members of NATO, and perhaps no countries face a graver challenge from the renewed aggression of Putin's Russia. The invasions of Georgia and Ukraine have caused many within the Baltics to fear for their own sovereignty as Putin attempts to delegitimize states that have a large Russian-speaking population. And that's why it's so important that the United States not waver in our commitment to the NATO alliance and to our Baltic friends to ensure that the ties we have forged remain strong in the face of increased pressure. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and want to apologize in advance. We have a Judiciary Committee markup, so I'll be in and out. But I'm anxious to hear what we can do and to reinforce and strengthen our NATO commitments and to continue the strong relationships the United States has built with our Baltic friends. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us today. I'll introduce all of you, and then we'll proceed. First, we have Paul Globe, who's a longtime expert in minority nationalities in the former Soviet Union. He has had a distinguished career working at various times for the United States government, the State Department, as well as Radio Free Europe. He has been honored by the governments of all three Baltic republics for his efforts to promote their independence. Alicia Shaw Samp, okay, a senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She is an expert on NATO and European defense strategies, and before joining CSIS, she was in a previous role as Director for NATO and European Strategic Affairs on the National Security Council staff. We have Matthew Rojansky, all right, he is the director of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He is a leading expert on U.S.-Russian relations and an adjunct professor at John Hopkins, and he is also serves as U.S. Executive Secretary for the Dartmouth Conference, and which is a two-track, I guess it's a track for a two-track of the Russian-U.S. Conflict Resolution Initiative. I hope I got that exactly right, but you get the picture. Mr. Edward Lucas is a senior editor for The Economist, and I might add, I read that magazine all the time. I think it's, frankly, the only magazine I do read all the time. And a senior vice president at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He has been observing and writing about developments in Eastern Europe and that part of the world for over 20 years. So we're very pleased to have you and grateful to have you with us. So as I say, if you could proceed with 5-minute opening statements, or you could add to that just for the record, and then we'll proceed with questions from the members. Mr. Globe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing on this most important topic and for giving me an opportunity to appear. I would like to dedicate my remarks to the late Alexander Einseln, the Estonian-American colonel who died about 10 days ago, who went to Estonia and became the commander of the Estonian Defense Forces and played a key role in transforming those forces into ones that could be integrated into the Western Alliance. It is an ancient observation that old generals always prepare to fight the last war, but we don't always think about what that means. It often means that they look for the same kind of threat that happened in the past and try to counter it, or not seeing it, decide there isn't any threat at all, and that they fail to prepare for combating new threats because the means they have adopted in the past to counter the threats of the past are no longer the ones that are most important. I do not believe, as long as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are members of the Western Alliance, that any Russian government will send its tanks over the eastern borders of those countries. I think that is almost unthinkable because I think it is almost certainly suicidal. Having said that, however, I believe there is a very real Russian threat that flows both from the purposes that Mr. Putin has announced for his government going back more than a decade, and the means he has chosen to use to pursue those purposes. On the one hand, Mr. Putin has clearly signaled that his foreign policy is driven by a desire to challenge the three bedrock principles that the international system that the United States took the lead in forming in the 20th century. First, the 1919 settlement that declared that the era of empires is over. He wants to restore one. Second, the settlement of 1945, which held that citizenship is more important than ethnicity. That's what we fought World War II about, when the Germans thought that ethnicity was more important than citizenship. And 1991, when the international community accepted the demise of the USSR as something that was irreversible. But the other aspect of the Russian threat is also serious, and that is that Mr. Putin has chosen to use the strategies of subversion rather than the strategies of open force. Far more often, we have seen actions by the Russian government that are those of intelligence services rather than those of defense ministries. What that means is if you're looking for actions by the military, you won't find them, but if you are looking at what goes on in banks, in government offices, in propaganda outlets, they're very much there. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have particular reasons for being concerned about both Mr. Putin's goals. If any of those are realized, they would be at risk, and his tactical approach because of their size and their propinquity to Russia. We in the United States tend to forget how small the Baltic countries are, how much they suffered under various aspects of Russian rule, and how much they have depended on the United States. For Putin, those three realities have a contradictory message. On the one hand, they mean that Mr. Putin is certainly aware that any military move against the Baltic countries would be resisted by the United States as part of its NATO alliance. And second, it means that Mr. Putin has an interest in challenging the West precisely there as a way of indicating that the West is more of a paper tiger than the West believes. I believe that what we need to do in order to promote Baltic security has less to do with the expansion of NATO presence there, although I welcome that presence, than it does with doing other things. And I would like to suggest three of what would be a very large list. First, as several of the members have pointed out, we need to encourage all three countries to complete the integration of ethnic minorities in their countries. That the progress that has been made is truly amazing. Indeed, last week it was announced that there are 4,000 ethnic Russians in Estonia who now declare that Estonian is their native language, which would have been unthinkable a decade ago. That's an impressive achievement. Second, we need to promote transparency of all economic and political activities, banking, the communication sector. And third, we need to involve Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians in as many conversations as possible with Russian counterparts. There are people in the West who are not interested in pushing that, who prefer to see the question of Russian power as being one that there is only a military response to. But in fact, it is in these other areas that the fight is going to be won or lost, and therefore we should be spending far more time developing strategies in those areas than in others. Thank you very much.
You may go right ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. I would like to make just 2 points regarding the current security situation in the Baltic states. My first point is foundational to this discussion. Russia is a threat. Russia is a threat to the Baltic states and more broadly to the post-World War II international order. In the Baltics, Russia has conducted cyber attacks, cross-border kidnappings, unannounced snap exercises with up to 80,000 troops just across the border. It has also violated their sovereign airspace, issued hostile statements, and filled their airwaves with propaganda. For an accurate threat picture, though, this behavior must be considered in the context of what Moscow has done and is doing beyond the Baltics. In addition to meddling in foreign elections, violating arms control agreements, and nuclear saber-rattling, Putin's bullying has escalated to the use of military force in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. In Ukraine, he has annexed Crimea and continues to sow instability and violence in the country's east. Thousands have died and over 1 million have been displaced. Let us also please not forget about the 298 civilians who were killed when a Russian-provided missile brought down a civilian airliner, or about the thousands of civilians killed by indiscriminate Russian bombs in Syria. Russia's actions reflect an effective blending of both conventional and unconventional tactics. These tactics are designed to circumvent U.S. and NATO red lines, confuse traditional response options, and use the virtues of the West against it. Putin likely doesn't want a war with the West, but he is finding he can get a lot done without one. For that reason, he has no intention of stopping now. He is becoming more emboldened over time and growing increasingly comfortable taking risks. What was once primarily an Eastern flank challenge is now hitting closer to home. Moscow may no longer be motivated by a communist ideology that sees it trying to overthrow democracies and replace them with dictatorships. But that does not mean Russia isn't still a threat to our democracy and our institutions. The difference today is that instead of offering an alternative, Russia is satisfied to create chaos and sow instability. It wants to knock the United States down a peg and break Western unity so we can't call shots Russia doesn't like or hold it accountable to the rule of law. The system, though, that Russia is seeking to undermine has served the United States well over the past 70 years, and without it, the world would undoubtedly be poorer, less free, and less safe. Russia may just be looking out for what it considers to be in its national interests, but then we need to do the same, and that entails pushing back to protect ourselves, our allies, and the international order. This brings me to my second point, which is that the steps taken by the United States and NATO to bolster security in the region are prudent and are what is minimally required. They are neither hostile nor provocative. While Russia has not resorted to military force in the Baltics, and while it's ever doing so remains extremely unlikely, the possibility cannot be discounted completely. To manage this risk, the United States and NATO have taken steps, as described in my written testimony, to establish a credible deterrence. Far from being provocative, these steps are designed to prevent war and to make clear the costs that would be entailed with any aggression. It may, in fact, be more provocative to do nothing, to invite Russian opportunism by baiting it with weak defenses. While it is important to debate what constitutes credible deterrence and what amounts to unhelpful provocation, one can also err in being too cautious, lending credence to Russia's reflexive protests and false indignation. I would argue there exists a wide gulf between the steps that have been taken to date and the steps that could be taken in the future to increase the West's leverage without sparking a conflict or even coming close. Step back and recall, for example, that despite recent troop increases, the U.S. combat presence in Europe remains a full brigade strength below what it was in 2012, prior to renewed tensions with Russia, and that NATO's largest exercise, conducted since the end of the Cold War, included about 30,000 troops. By contrast, Russia's Zapad exercise planned for later this year may reach up to 200,000. Thus, the idea that holding relatively moderately sized exercises on alliance territory constitutes provocation seems wildly unfair. NATO is also not the one flying with its transponders off, failing to announce exercises in accordance with the Vienna document, and buzzing ships in the Black and Baltic seas. While it is also fair to consider the West's role in contributing to the current standoff with Russia, suggesting moral equivalencies or assigning blame does not solve the current problem. It neither changes how the West or Russia view their security interests, nor makes what we seek to preserve any less valid. To conclude, none of this means we cannot still cooperate with Russia where it is in our interests, but rushing to make deals with Moscow to secure what would amount to short-term gains may well end up sacrificing more fundamental goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Rozhansky. But you need to turn your mic on.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Meeks. I'm enormously grateful to have this opportunity, and I've got to do this, the disclaimer, personal views only, not those of the Wilson Center, which of course is a congressionally chartered memorial to President Wilson. So we're very grateful that we can fulfill our public interest mission in participating here. You know, I think I understood your question, Mr. Chairman, about Russia's specific acts rather than just sort of vague general ideas of a threat, and the reasonableness of American response as soliciting an analysis of how the Russians are thinking and why. What do they intend, and is there evidence for their intent? And so I'd like to tackle that problem as directly as I can, and I break it down into three parts. Anytime that I think about a threat, I try to break it down into motive, capability, and opportunity. So those are the three parts I want to tackle in that order. In terms of motive, let's look at what Russia's actions have been against other states to try to discern a motive vis-a-vis, in particular, its neighborhood, or what Russians call the near abroad. Generally speaking, Russians do not view other countries in the near abroad as fully sovereign, certainly not in the way they see themselves or the United States. Obviously, we know that President Medvedev talked about a sphere of privileged influence. The Russians have supported separatists in Moldova, in Georgia. They've invaded Ukraine. This is well-known ground. In terms of specific actions against the Baltic states, famously in 2007 around the Bronze Soldier conflict, they intervened with cyber attacks against Estonia. In 2014, they abducted Eston Kover, an Estonian security agent from the border, essentially kidnapped him. In Latvia, they've mobilized ethnic Russian voters, stirred up anti-government sentiment in Latgalia. In Lithuania, they've mounted an information war, disparaging living standards for Lithuanians and encouraging them to move to Kaliningrad, a neighboring exclave of Russia. And of course, there's been sophisticated social media campaigns backing all of these things up. Now, what do Russians want in the Baltic states? Basic motivations. Certainly, they fear the American presence there, what it may lead to, but they'd like to maintain basically stable political and economic ties. Now, much is made of the Russian-speaking population. It's a tricky issue. Who's an ethnic Russian? Who's a Russian speaker? In terms of percentages, we're maybe dealing with somewhere between 30 and 36% in Latvia, 25 to 28% in Estonia, 5 to 8% in Lithuania, depending on how you define those numbers. Sometimes they're concentrated, like in Narva in eastern Estonia. Sometimes they're very well integrated, like in the city of Riga, the capital of Latvia. Now, Putin talks about the Russian world, within which these people would certainly be included, as being a major priority for Russian foreign policy and being the largest diaspora in Europe. He claims 25 million Russians left outside the borders of the Russian Federation. And in 2014, in a speech in Riga, Russia's Commissioner for Human Rights, Konstantin Dolgov, said, "It has to be stated with sadness that a huge number of our compatriots abroad, whole segments of the Russian world, continue to face serious problems securing their rights and lawful interests. We will not tolerate the creeping offensive against the Russian language that we're seeing in the Baltics." So, does Russia intend to use force in the Baltics? Interestingly, most Russian sources say no, they don't. Dmitry Trenin says Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are safe, even if they don't feel that way. The Kremlin has no interest in risking nuclear war by attacking a member state, and the sphere of Russian control to which Putin aspires certainly excludes these countries. Now, Russians would have plenty of reasons to make these claims, but it may be that they have other motives and intentions in being threatening towards the Baltic states, like signaling to other post-Soviet countries, in particular Belarus, Kazakhstan, part of the Eurasian core countries on Russia's borders. And most military deployments, if you look at Russian military deployments, are about exerting control and dominance over Ukraine. Capability, I'll keep this very short. Russia's military capability is stronger than it was, for sure. It comes nowhere close to what the United States can field, much less the NATO alliance. And one of the challenges in assessing Russia's actual capability is the bread and toast problem vis-a-vis Russian troops that are simply always going to be in and around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad versus troops that are there for the specific reason of sort of either masking or preparing for an attack on the Baltic states. But there are other capabilities of concern, non-military capabilities, and again, this comes back to the issue of Russian speakers. Russian television has been called a couch potato's dream, an attractive, even mesmerizing mix of frothy morning shows, high decibel discussion shows, tearjerker serials and song contests, peppered with news bulletins and current events shows that toe the Kremlin line. So you get the idea that Russian broadcasting creates a very sophisticated media milieu within which people are persuaded by the Russian worldview. But be careful not to generalize here. At the end of the day, Russian speakers, ethnic Russians in the Baltic states, they're people. Many of them don't necessarily like Mr. Putin. Many of them have no desire to abandon their EU citizenship, which they have thanks to being citizens of the Baltic states. And many of them tune out from politics altogether. The last point, and I'll end quickly here. On opportunity, there's both good news and bad news. The good news is that Mr. Goebel's exactly right. The Russians do not seek to provoke a conflict with a nuclear-armed alliance in NATO, and as long as the Baltic states are NATO members, that's going to be the case. The bad news is that a crisis is still absolutely possible. A crisis is possible either, imagine a scenario within which this ethnic Russian or Russian language issue is provoked, even completely made up, and then blown out of proportion by Russian media. There's a firm response from local authorities, and that results in a crisis. And the other possible crisis here is a military crisis, this so-called heavy metal diplomacy, a Russian aircraft coming close to an American ship or another NATO-flagged vessel. So definitely in terms of motive, capability, and opportunity, we're looking at a real threat, a real set of concerns, but it's important to see it in context. Thank you.
In context, that's good. We're going to be discussing that as we get into the questions and, and answers. And finally, Mr. Lucas, you may proceed.
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and distinguished members, it's an honor and privilege to come here and give testimony to this committee on this vitally important subject. I've been dealing with this issue since the early 1980s, and my message is very straightforward and is contained in my written testimony. I will then go on to answer some of the questions that have come up in discussion already. Russia's a revisionist power. It doesn't like the way the world is at the moment. It wants to change it. It has the means to do this if we don't keep ourselves united and strong. So far, it's doing really well, much better than many people would have suspected if you'd been thinking 10, 15 years ago that we'd be discussing a threat from Russia of the kind we're discussing now, and people have thought that was crazy. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. You mentioned in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, that we put a hostile military alliance that stretched to Russia's border and put troops there, and the Russians don't like that. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves, why are they there? Why did this change? Why has this happened? And of course, until during the 1990s, we didn't have NATO membership in the Baltic states. And we expanded it for a reason. We expanded because these countries were scared. And there was enough going on that they were right to be scared. After 2004, many people said, that's it, job done. Russia will not touch a NATO member, and there's no reason to worry about it anymore. We had no plans, no contingency plans for defending the Baltic states. We had no troop deployments there. We had no exercises there. That would have been a stable situation, but Russia provoked, undermined, and subverted the Baltic states, notably in the Bronze Soldier attack, but many other things as well. And so after 2008, in the war in Georgia, President Obama said we need contingency plans. We developed the plans. We then increased them. There was a huge jolt came with the 2009 Zapad exercises, which practiced the invasion and occupation of the Baltic states and finished up with a dummy nuclear attack on Warsaw. That was a real wake-up call to the West. Russia tends to do the things that it rehearses. And everything we've done, on a much smaller scale since then, I think has been a response to Russia raising the ante. Russia is testing our will in the Baltic states. And the best way of guaranteeing that we keep the peace that we have is by responding to that with calmness and firmness. You asked for specific examples. Well, I think the military exercise, and particularly these terrifying snap exercises, which happen at no notice and involve large numbers of troops hurtling towards the border when we have no idea really what's going on, are perhaps the biggest example. I'd also mention air intrusions, the role of money in Baltic politics. And if you read the reports of the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian security agencies, which are available on the internet, they list in chilling detail the things that Russia is doing inside those countries. I'd also like to respond to the idea that it's a big ask from the Baltic states. They want a lot from America. Well, that's true, but you're not just defending them, you're defending the whole international order. And if you're worried about America's leadership in the world, and you're worried about America's leadership in Asia, and you're worried about whether your allies take you seriously, well, the Baltics is high noon. That's where it starts. If you can't defend the Baltic states, your treaty allies, then you have no credibility in other parts of the world. So you're defending the whole rules-based order, not just the Baltic states. And finally, I would just point out that the Baltic states are not just consumers of security, they're also providers. They were warning us about this 20 years ago when we weren't listening. They see things that we don't see. They can go to places that we don't go. They understand things that we don't understand. And we, in my country, in Britain, in your country here in the United States, and other NATO allies, we are eagerly and greedily lapping up some of this expertise, some of these capabilities they have in cyber, in intelligence, in other things, which fill gaps, stuff that we neglected, capabilities that we got rid of in the past 20 or 30 years because we thought we'd never need them again. So they contribute a lot to us. What should we do? Well, first of all, we've got to understand that Russia is trying to change the rules and be clear that we want to defend that rules-based order. It's worth it. It brings peace, it brings prosperity, it brings freedom. It really matters. We need to raise the cost to Mr. Putin of his attacks, and I strongly endorse the point about raising visa sanctions on the Russian elite. We have no quarrel with the people of Russia. They suffer from this regime just as much as anybody else does, if not more. But we should say to those top 1,000, 10,000 people in Russia, if you preach anti-Westernism, if you say that the West is decadent, the fount of all evil, imperialist, horrible, backward, and so on, well, you can't then expect to launder money in the West. You can't expect to send your kids here to be educated. You can't send your families here for medical treatment. You can't come here on holiday. We can do that. That's not a quarrel with the Russian people. That's targeting the sanctions on the elite. And finally, I think we just need to do a bit more on deterrence. NATO has changed. What NATO's done in the Baltics is very small. It's 1/10, 1/20th of what Russia's done. It's already a game changer. Just having a few more American soldiers in the Baltics would make a very big difference because Russia takes you really seriously. And I would finish up by saying we should look at the Baltic states like West Berlin. There were many things in West Berlin we didn't like during the Cold War. I know you, Chairman Rohrabacher, were a regular visitor there, and it was tremendously important symbolically for us. We didn't try and defend West Berlin militarily as West Berlin. We didn't put a Maginot Line around West Berlin anymore. We should put a Maginot Line down the Baltics. We said, this is where it stops. This is the furthest outpost of the West, and by defending West Berlin, we defend every member of the Western Alliance, and we should look at the Baltic states in the same way. Thanks, sir.
Well, thank you very much, and I see we're on our own. Me and you, baby. And me and you, baby. Let me start out by saying that I apologize that this is not a balanced panel. You all have basically the same message, and we should have had at least one person to present the other perspective, and we did not. And I'm concerned about that. And yeah, when I'm here, there's so much one can do on my own. Okay. So with me, let me first apologize about that because I don't believe this is a balanced panel. I mean, I'll just have to say you all are intellectuals and you all are good sources of information, but we need to juxtapose your arguments with someone else. And we didn't do it, and so we failed. And maybe we'll have another hearing where the points that you've made, you can have 2 or 3 of you, and maybe someone on the other side who could tell us, refute some of the points that have been made. So with that said, let me just go into a few, hopefully, some questions that'll be provocative questions anyway. I did ask for specific military aggression and acts there that would, I didn't seem to get any, frankly. I hear about the massing of 300,000 troops in Russian territory, and Russia is an act of aggression against their neighboring countries, but amassing NATO troops and tanks in their neighboring countries on their border is not aggression. Talk about a double standard. I would think that that is a major double standard. I will have to say that with my friend, my fellow journalist, a former journalist as I am, that I believe that the idea of declaring the Baltics like to be similar to Berlin demonstrates a basic perceptual problem of why we are heading towards in the wrong direction. And that is, the Cold War is over. As long as we are thinking about Russia as the way it was during that time period, and others, and Berlin, West Berlin, as being threatened as it was at that time, in a government that was controlled by the Communist Party, that was an ideological-based party that wanted to create Marxist, atheist dictatorships throughout the world, replace democracies with Marxist dictatorships. That is not the world we live in today, and it's not the Russia. Russia is different than what it was. Now, how different? Let me just ask this. When we haven't, again, I asked for some specific things in the Baltics. I know there was a cyber attack, which someone brought up. I'd like to ask about that cyber attack in Estonia. If you know about this, I'm sure you should. There was a cyber attack when the Russians and the Estonians got into a personality match when the Estonians said, we're going to take down this statue that is dedicated to the Russian soldiers who gave their lives in liberating the Baltics from the Nazis. And at that point, there was a massive cyber attack, which really it was very extensive, and it was a heavy-duty attack by Russia on Estonia. How long ago did that happen? What year was that? When was it?
2007, sir.
2007. And since that time, have there been any attacks of that magnitude in the Baltics? Any other attacks since 2007? Now, I will tell you, we have heard over and over and over again about the incredible cyber attacks, and that was 2007, and there was that, I'm not excusing the fact somebody's insulting, France insulted us a number of times, and we didn't get so angry at them that we punished them, and some people, there's all sorts of stories about that. And what about when we were talking about their 300,000 is a threat, but our NATO 30,000 aren't, is the panel aware that part of those NATO exercises, and there's been a number of them now, part of that has been B-52 flights from England headed and then turning around at the Russian border? Is anyone here not consider that a provocative act?
I do not.
You do not?
that.
Okay, so you think a nuclear weapons delivery system aimed at the heart of Russia and then turning around right on the border is not hostile and provocative?
It might be if they weren't doing the same thing to us. They are flying Bear and Blackjack bombers off the coast of Alaska around the outer edges of Europe. So the flights are
That is not the
awash.
same. Let me just note, what you're saying is ridiculous. It is not the same as aiming a flight of bombers into the capital areas meaning St. Petersburg and Moscow, versus flying along a coast. Everybody has a right to fly along someone's coast. And in fact, what's fascinating is, now let me ask you this, are there also ships as part of those exercises that we had? Did we have any nuclear weapons capability of carrying ships that were part of that? You didn't even know that? Well, yes, there were. So now tell me, if we actually are bringing nuclear weapons delivery systems to the Russian border, you don't believe that's provocative. Does anyone else here agree with that?
Sir,
Yes, go right ahead.
Can I respond to that? I think one has to look at this over a period of say, 10 years. Say we start in 2004, when we've expanded NATO and we've built quite good relations with Russia through the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the NATO-Russia Council. Things have deteriorated since then, but in each case, the deterioration has started with actions on the Russian side and been followed by much smaller actions on ours. Now, you mentioned nuclear weapons, and this is an extremely important point. Russia has a very large arsenal of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, and these are integrated into its military doctrine and integrated into its exercises. And they practice getting these nuclear artillery shells, depth charges, short-range weapons out of the bunkers onto delivery systems. And they do this again and again and again. We in the West have almost given up on tactical nuclear weapons. We have very few. Those that we have are kept a very long way away from the Baltic states, chiefly in bunkers in the Netherlands. Our exercises do not involve those use. It's a specific part of Russian military doctrine to do what they call escalate to de-escalate, which means if they think they are losing a conventional war, they will go nuclear. And they make no secret about that. And they talk about these nuclear weapons all the time in a way that the neighbors find terrifying. Not just the NATO members. They say this to the Finns and to the Swedes. You mentioned B-52 flights. I don't know whether you're aware of what happened on Good Friday 2014, I think it was, when a Russian flight carried out a dummy attack on Stockholm and on another very important military target in Sweden, at a time when the Swedish Air Force had taken the weekend off because it was Easter. They had to scramble Danish fighters from Lithuania to intercept these Russians. In my country...
So the Russian planes,
may I just finish?
and the incident you're describing, they actually penetrated...
no, they turned around at the last minute. And we also had a similar event in... And I mean, if you penetrate someone's airspace...
So they turned around at the last moment. You remember that, and you condemn that, but you don't condemn U.S. B-52 bombers and nuclear weapons carrying ships going right to the Russian border?
I think it's very important that the Russians are trying to make us think that we have no nuclear deterrence. And they've said, and they say privately and publicly, they don't believe that NATO deterrence works. And so long as NATO is a nuclear alliance, we have to show that we are nuclear capable. Now, we have many gaps on the escalation ladder. We can't match...
Sir, I would just have to add that I believe it demonstrates a double standard that will give the Russians a message that we are judging our behavior differently than we're judging yours.
Can I respond to that, sir?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry we don't have other witnesses here to make these points, and I'm going to have to give it to him, but I will let you answer that, and then we have to...
I just wanted to respond to your point about West Berlin, sir.
Yes.
You said the Cold War is over, and it's true, the old Cold War is over, but as I said in my opening remarks, Russia is trying to change the rules. Russia doesn't like the way the world operates at the moment. It doesn't like American leadership. It doesn't like the Atlantic Alliance. It doesn't like multilateral rules-based organizations like the EU. And that is a threat. It's not the same as the Soviet Union. It's much weaker. But the symbolic bastion of the West is the Baltic states because they are militarily vulnerable. Okay. And in that sense, I think it's very similar to West Berlin.
Well, let me just note that Great Britain seems to not like the EU either, do they? People of Great Britain decided they might not like that as well. And yeah, the institutions that were created during the Cold War are beginning to not evaporate, but to readjust, and some of them will disappear, some of them will remain strong. But this isn't the Cold War. Look, again, let me just remind you, you're looking at the ultimate Cold Warrior here. I mean, this is not some guy who did not believe we should confront the Soviet Union. And I was deeply involved with that for 20 years of my life, actually 30 years of my life. And I find, well, anyway, we'll have a second round of questions. There's only two of us.
Chairman,
But
would it be
and
possible before you move on to add something on the nuclear?
with permission from my
Yeah, I was going to give you the,
Okay, I appreciate that. I just feel badly because I think I was invited to try to elucidate Russian thinking, and the conclusion of much of my research into Russian analysis and the statements of Russian leaders and the disposition of Russian forces has been that while there are real causes for concern, and that's why I broke it into that three-part analysis of motive, capability, and opportunity, that nonetheless we are not facing an acute, immediate Russian military threat to the Baltic states. And there are two principal reasons for that on the military side. Speaking about nuclear deterrence, one is that nuclear deterrence works. And the Russian sources I looked at were very clear that that's a big part of the reason why they wouldn't, under any circumstances, so assume plenty of other motives potentially to intervene in the Baltic states. The fact that you're talking about intervening against members of a nuclear-armed alliance makes that, I mean, the Russian sources are very clear. They have no desire to provoke that, and there are certainly plenty of other targets that would be more desirable. The second issue, and I made this point very quickly before, and I do encourage you to take a look at my written remarks as well, is this issue of disposition, of location, that even if kind of politically and psychologically the Baltic states may have a similar resonance to West Berlin today, they're in a different spot on the map. They are just a couple hundred kilometers away from St. Petersburg. They're, in the case of Lithuania, actually bordering on Kaliningrad, on a heavily militarized Russian exclave. And so what that means is there's a certain amount of Russian military activity we're just going to see. We're going to keep seeing it, and it's sort of normal that we would see it because that's where Russia's population is and that's where their assets are. So I think that's why, in terms of context, I think it's very important that we interpret Russia's actions and threats, not with charity, but in the context in which they are actually taking place and not in a sort of fear-laden fever dream kind of politicized context. That would be my only.
And Mr. Meeks, thank you very much for that.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that the committee would love to have maybe General Flynn or Paul Manafort come to testify, because they will have the opposite, you know, they will hear their point of view. They may be great witnesses. Well, let me jump into this because and maybe I'll ask Ms. Samp, because we started and we were talking about that, because over the past 2 decades since the end of the Cold War, you know, we talk about what we're doing or what NATO's there, but the Russians have also engaged in exercises and have often quadrupled, is that not correct, the size of the NATO forces in the region. In fact, a lot of the Russian exercises have, you know, you've seen over 100,000 troops. And NATO, our Baltic allies, have been, you know, they've been talking and telling us this for years, that it's not just something happening on one side, but there's a threat that they see right across the border, 100,000 troops, unannounced. You know, they do these, you know, unannounced. So, and so my first question is, actually, has the U.S. military presence in Europe increased or decreased since the end of the Cold War? 2, is the post-Wales response enough? And what happens, or what do you see with reference to the comparison of the exercises that the Russians have been going on for the last few years?
Sir, thank you for that question. I would describe the scale of Russian activities as an order of magnitude greater, that's 10 times greater than anything that NATO and the U.S. is doing. The size of the U.S. presence in Europe since the end of the Cold War has decreased dramatically. At its height, it was about 350,000 troops. That would have been in the late 80s. We are now at about 62,000 troops. With the rotational forces that we have put in since 2014, that number has risen by about 6,000 rotational, non-permanent forces. And is it enough? I would argue there's more to do. I think we should seriously considering having at least as many troops in Europe now as we did in 2012.
Does anybody disagree? Agree? Mr. Goebel?
Congressman, I would like to come at this in a slightly different way that I think speaks to that. I think we're wrong to both operate on a model that the Cold War has been restored and that the Cold War is over. The one implies that we're going back to a status quo ante of 1991, and therefore we need to respond as we did then. The other is to imply that when you don't have a Cold War, the only possible default setting is cooperation, peace, happiness, and niceness with people. History suggests otherwise. There are competitions between countries. I've tried to say in my testimony, perhaps not very well, it's clear in my written remarks, I think that we need to address what Russia is doing less in terms of a military threat than in terms of the other kinds of threats it poses. Using subversive measures, using massive amounts of money. I would be far happier to learn that we were investing in more counter cyber attack centers, that we were investing in more transparency in banking systems, especially, I would say, in the 3 Baltic countries, in Latvia, where the banks have been used as a major money laundering enterprise for Russian oligarchs, than to talk immediately about more troops anywhere. That's what I believe.
But let me ask this question, because I think in your written testimony you do talk about the fact that you think the lines of the communication between the Kremlin and the Baltic states should increase, or they should be there. Now, given the subversion that you're saying is taking place, and given that, you know, we're seeing it and feeling it, you know, from the hearings we just had right here in the United States,
right,
as to some things with reference to Russia trying to get involved in our politics and democracy. Do you think that, you know, that the suppression that Mr. Putin obviously has at home against the media, et cetera, and then the subversion that he's trying to do in other countries, how will that ever change under Mr. Putin's leadership?
Congressman, the good news is Vladimir Putin will not live forever. That's the really best news I can tell you from this region. More than that, moreover, Mr. Putin has changed his own approach domestically and in foreign policy terms several times since he came to power. He was installed in power at the end of 1999. Encouraging conversations has at least 3 effects, all of which are positive. First, if the Baltic countries show themselves willing to have such conversations and the Russians refuse to do so, the onus of not talking is clearly demonstrated. Second, the notion that people in the Baltic countries are interested in having conversations with their Russian counterparts can be an important conduit of information and influence into the Russian Federation. And third, and this is something when I was working on Baltic affairs at the State Department 25 years ago, while the president of Estonia at one point famously said he'd rather have Canada for a neighbor and that he wished there was a very large ocean between himself and the Russian Federation, the reality is that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are going to be Russia's neighbors for a very long time. Now, one would like that relationship to be such that Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians will make the choices about what they will do rather than those choices being made in Moscow. And that's what this is about. But the best way to do that, in my mind, as I said in my written testimony, is for us to be promoting those kinds of transparency changes domestically that limit the ability of Moscow to engage in the subversive activities which it has been doing consistently since 1991.
Let me do this. We have a vote that's up, and I know my colleague may have a question. And I did want to ask Mr. Lucas one other question. I think that the chairman had made a statement, and it's important for me to know also. The benefits, you know, can you tell us a little bit what the benefits have been for the Baltic states to continue to be in the EU membership? And Has the EU supported their liberty and independence in face of the aggressive of Russia? And is there any difference, and I think you being, Mr. Rohrabacher indicated because of your accent, of course, and being English, is there any difference, or what do you see the difference now with with Brexit and NATO and the EU, in your opinion on that?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm strongly against Brexit, and I think it was a bad mistake by my country. But the position in the Baltic states is very different. There's overwhelming support for the EU in all three countries, and the benefits have been colossal, chiefly in the integration into decision-making, because in this rules-based format, small countries get a voice. This is not the Europe of the 19th century, where the big countries do the deals that they can and the small countries accept the outcomes that they must. We have people from the Baltic states in really senior positions and making a difference in the EU's decision-making. Very large sums of money have flown into the Baltic states, and the infrastructure has been transformed by EU money. The people in the Baltic states have the right to live and work and travel all through the European Union as European EU citizens. This is it's extremely popular in the Baltic states, and I think one shouldn't read too much. The British thing is very specific and very different. I just wanted to make one other point. You were asking about why are there no examples of military aggression in the Baltic states. Well, that's because NATO works, Chairman Rohrabacher. If there had been military aggression in the Baltic states since 2004, we would have responded in military terms. And I'm sorry, I was just saying you were asking why there are no examples of military aggression in the Baltic states. That's because NATO works. Russia tries other stuff, and it does it. And my fellow panelists have referred to some of the examples, and I could give many more. But we have drawn a red line in the Baltics, and that's a good thing. And everybody is better off as a result, not least the Russians.
Thank you very much. I will, as the chairman, use my. We didn't have a big enough panel here. We didn't have somebody on the panel here to offer the other arguments. I'm just going to have a very short closing statement then. And then I'm going to have to run off and vote. We have a vote on right now. I'm sorry we couldn't let this go on for another half hour and had a better exchange. I disagree. Look, I fought in Afghanistan against Russian troops, all right? I was a speechwriter for President Reagan for 7.5 years. Many of the things that were, one of the things my friend quoted was something I had worked on with President Reagan. Let me note, I just think there is a mindset, and it's represented right here in the panel. I'm going to be very frank with you that we're dealing with the Soviet Union now, except maybe for this gentleman on the end. But this is not the threat that we faced, and we have been treating Russia in a way. If the Russians were doing to us what we are doing to them, it would. I mean, our manned bombers heading straight into Moscow and St. Petersburg, no, it is not justified. It is provocative and it's hostile. And the fact is that our Baltic friends, they don't even feel threatened enough to spend money for their own defense. So what does that tell you? That tells you that we've got people here as well as there that have a motive in that they hate the Russians, all right? Not all the Baltic people hate the Russians, but there is hatred there for a just reason. While the Russians controlled the Baltics, they murdered millions of people. And their Russians were in Eastern Europe, and they murdered millions of people. And yes, that's because they were there when it was communism. It was communism that motivated that occupation. It was communism that motivated Russians to go in different places in the world to try to supplant democratic governments with atheist dictatorships. It was communism. It wasn't the Russian people. And I will just have to say that the current Russian government is flawed dramatically. We all know that. But it is not the communist government that existed before. Just this thing, okay, so I guess there was no other major cyber attacks that basically were able to cripple the country except for the one in Estonia. I asked that. So I guess as far back as 2007, we're going to start using that as an example of hostility today. There is, as I say, The people up there don't think, in the Baltics, don't think they're under military threat because they don't even spend their own allocation for their own defense. And finally, let me just say that, I don't know, just when I look at Russia, I would hope that we do not judge other countries differently than we judge our own. And I will have to say that the United States has military forces all over the world today. And in some cases, we are places that we shouldn't be. And sometimes it's great and important for our national security. But the idea that when a Russian spy ship comes down our coast, that we all go crazy about it and start saying this is provocative, which is what I heard in the news. But it doesn't make any difference about us having our warships, some of which can carry nuclear warheads, right up next to the Russian coast. These double standards, we got. All I'm saying is, let's build a more peaceful world by at least dealing with the people who control Russia today and try to reach an understanding what is in your interest and what is in our interest. And today we're acting in a very belligerent way, as if, no, you don't have the right to do things in your own interest. And to have a military exercise in your own country. We are comparing us having nuclear weapons delivery systems and thousands of troops right on the Russian border. We're saying, well, no, that's not aggression, but 300,000 troops inside Russia themselves, itself, its own country, that's aggression? This is nonsense. And we have to, if we're going to have a peace in this world, we have to be realistic, and we have to say to ourselves, how do we do this? And it's not giving up territory. Nobody's talking about giving up the Baltics. But let's not say over and over again, which I have heard, the Russian aggression in the Baltics. I've heard that expression, military aggression in the Baltics, dozens, if not 30 or 40 times, used to justify a hostile foreign policy towards Russia. And I will tell you, nothing that I have heard today justifies that phrase being used, Russian military aggression in the Baltics. So with that said, I want to thank my panel. I'm sorry that I was able to do this tirade at the end. I really wanted it to be an exchange where you could refute me and back and forth, because that's what we're supposed to have here. But I have to go vote, and my friend has to go vote as well. I want to thank you very much, and thank you for putting up with me venting at the very last minute without your chance to retort. But if you'd like to put in the record to retort, we'll do it. Okay? Thank you all very much.
What?